A large and growing group of European leaders will join Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelenskyy for his crucial meeting with Donald Trump at the White House on Monday. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, French President Emmanuel Macron and several other leaders want to press home Kyiv's perspectives regarding a possible deal to end the war. Ukraine's President Zelenskyy has already arrived in Brussels and is preparing for his meeting with Trump tomorrow. Zelenskyy is currently with EU Chief von der Leyen. Later, they will participate in a video conference with the other leaders in preparation for tomorrow. Ahead of that conference call, Zelenskyy and von der Leyen addressed the state of negotiations on the war. We'll hear first from the Ukrainian president and then from the EU chief.
Need real negotiations, which means they can start where the front line is now. The contact line is the best line for talking, and Europeans support this. Russia is still unsuccessful in Donetsk region. Putin has been unable to take it for 12 years, and the constitution of Ukraine makes it impossible to give up territory or trade land. Since the territorial issue is so important, it should be discussed only by the leaders of Ukraine and Russia at the trilateral Ukraine, United States, Russia.
As I've often said, Ukraine must become a steel porcupine, undigestible for potential invaders. We welcome President Trump's willingness to contribute to Article 5-like security guarantees for Ukraine. And the coalition of the willing, including the European Union, is ready to do its share.
Let's unpack this and turn to our correspondent, Anchal Vohra in Brussels. Anchal, that's quite a bit to unpack there. What's your take on what was just said there?
I think what President Zelenskyy there was saying was that he is not going to give up territory that Russia has not yet occupied. Definitely, that was a definite no. And he said, I think he seemed to imply when he said it's impossible constitutionally for Ukraine to, recognize the occupation of its territory. He said he cannot recognize legally that Russia is actually in occupation of Ukrainian territory or recognize it as Russian territory. These are the two things he said. Now, let me give you the background. There was a report in Financial Times which claimed that President Putin had told President Trump in Alaska that if Ukraine gives up all of Donbass, because Russia does not control all of it, then Russia will not occupy any more territory in the future. President Zelenskyy, I think, seems to be reacting to that. And he's saying, we're not going to give up. We're not going to sit back if Russia comes forward and tries to take more territory. Now, Ukrainians believe that they do hold critical areas in Donbass region which allow them to push back the Russians. And if they give these up, which they definitely don't want to, but even if that conversation were to happen, they constitutionally can't. And thirdly, if that were to be the case in any future scenario, then it allows Russia to invade them again and attack them again, which is essentially what they fear.
Now, it sounds like aside from the actual territorial disputes, it all hinges on security guarantees. What would they look like?
Now, Zelenskyy there seemed to be asking for more details. However, the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen seemed to be there confirming that President Trump indeed has agreed to Article 5-like guarantees. Let's unpack that. Now, Trump has said he's not okay with Ukraine joining NATO. And even in Ukraine, there are countries that, are not very comfortable with being party to war. They're not being comfortable to Article 5 being invoked, which essentially in the NATO treaty says that if one member state is attacked, then everybody is at war. So what they're thinking of is Article 5-like guarantees, which means Ukraine is not a part of NATO. But if Russia invades Ukraine again, then members can support Ukraine in the manner that they see fit, including the US. Now, Ursula von der Leyen seemed to be suggesting that President Trump is on board. She said another thing which is quite important here, which is Ukraine being a member of the EU. And even the EU treaty says that if a member of the EU comes under attack, then member states must do all they can to assist that country. So she said this is also kind of a security guarantee, and I've reported on this. I've spoken to several analysts, and some of them say this is perhaps an even stronger security guarantee if, and when the Ukraine becomes a member of the EU.
Now, let me just count this. NATO Chief Rutte, EU Chief von der Leyen, plus Merz, Starmer, Macron, Meloni of Italy, Stubb of Finland. That's what I call a very impressive lineup. Everybody who is anybody in Europe seems to be travelling to DC on Monday. What message does this massive lineup of leaders send?
I think it's definitely a show of strength and of unity, and we don't really usually see European member states acting with such speed. I mean, the bureaucracy here in Brussels is quite cumbersome. The member states are essentially trying to tell President Trump that they're solidly behind Ukraine, in Ukraine's corner, and they're trying to warn him about President Putin. They're trying to come up with a strategy that warns President Trump sufficiently about how Russia has in the past violated its agreements, to impress upon him the importance of security guarantees, to make sure that Ukraine just isn't forced to give up its territory yet again. Remember, Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, has occupied it ever since. Now they have occupied more and want even more before they can stop fighting. So the idea of this show of strength is to convince President Trump again, and the member states have had relative success in convincing President Trump to also see this side of the story and not just be convinced by everything President Putin tells him.
Now, what if Trump doesn't listen to them? Will the Europeans go their own way?
Now, this is a very important question. The Europeans, their first strategy is to keep the US on board. And in a way, they've succeeded because they've decided to increase their defense spending to 5% of their respective national GDPs. And that essentially means that the Europeans will buy more from America, as they've already started to do, and supply those weapons to Ukraine. There is reason to believe that President Trump would want that, would want Europeans to spend more and buy more defense equipment from the US. However, if still the deal seems to be leaning more towards what President Putin wants and less towards factoring in Ukrainian and European interests, it's going to be a very difficult situation for Europe. Remember, Europe also needs US support. Yes, Ukraine does, but the EU member states also need, because they depend on superior US capabilities in several areas, especially in reconnaissance. So they're not going to go against the US, but it's definitely very difficult territory.
DW correspondent Anchal Vohra there reporting from Brussels. Thank you, Anchal. And we're now joined by Andrew Denison, Director of the Foreign Policy and Consulting Center, Transatlantic Networks. Now, Zelenskyy is expected for talks with Trump in Washington tomorrow, and we're hearing German Chancellor Merz and other European leaders will be present there as well. What do you think they actually can achieve?
What can they achieve? That they have achieved a visit to the White House with Zelenskyy tomorrow is already something. Many people were afraid that Trump and Putin would do the deal and there wouldn't be any consultation with Ukraine or with Europe. The term was over the heads of Europe. Well, we see that, yes, Europe wasn't there in Alaska, but they were on everyone's minds. And now, together, this phalanx, Europe unified with influence, with an ability to affect the outcome of the negotiations and the sustainability of an eventual peace, I think that they can accomplish a good bit, because Trump can't do this alone. And when the Europeans are saying, come on, let's be hard, it's easier for Trump to be hard than when the American president's saying, let's be hard, and the Europeans are saying, oh, no, not so hard. So I think we're on the right path. It's a fast-moving story, but we're on the right path.
It is indeed. Now, the US is reportedly open now to providing security guarantees for Ukraine. What do you think they could look like?
I think that a small adjustment in the balance of power on the ground in Ukraine would already make it very difficult for the Russians to advance. We see how Ukraine is more or less able to hold the line. Sometimes they give territory, but not. Ultimately, the American guarantee that's most important is the nuclear guarantee, that the Europeans can hold the line, but if Russia threatens to escalate against NATO territory, then America steps in and says, we have escalation dominance. Don't go down that road.
Andrew Denison there, Director of the Foreign Policy and Consulting Centre, Transatlantic Networks. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Yeah, have a nice Sunday.